I'm Rene Mullen, and this is Pen and Poet. Intimate conversations and performances with poets, both page and stage, established and up and coming. A safe space where you can meet new artists, maybe gain an appreciation for the spoken and written word. This is poetry for the rest of us, the reachable, understandable, digestible poetry.
That night, Zapata washed my feet. Handlebar whiskers scratched the itch between my legs like myth.
On the days of our births, we breathe the dust of these memories, and it scours our flesh, smooths our skins, fills our lungs.
All the dead desire most is to live in our memory. All they desire most is to laugh and to dance.
Hey everyone. Before I get to my interview with Gina Marselle, I want to give a huge shout out to my very first Patreon supporter. This person is a friend of mine who moved pretty far away, and we still keep in touch the old-fashioned way, through snail mail. And we started a strange little trend of writing poems on the envelopes that we send each other. Actually, it started because they draw such fun designs all over the envelope, and I can't draw. So I started writing poems on the envelopes. Anyway, their pen name is Reese Spiegel. They are a writer of fiction and now poetry, mostly on the envelopes that I have in my possession. Reese, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is not a cheap endeavor, but I love doing it, and apparently many of you enjoy listening. The poets are worth it. I love meeting new artists and listening to their poetry, but also, since Reese Spiegel supported the show at the level that they did, I'm going to read one of their poems that was on one of those envelopes that they have given me permission to share. And it's a short one. It's kind of a Senru style. Has no name. And here goes. Eyes like leaves whisper. Green, delicate, unfolding, bury me in your roots. Such a great poem. And I have to say that I've probably read it about 24 times now between when I got it on that envelope and when I was given permission to use it for the podcast and to share it. And I have to say that each time I read it, I kind of get a little something else out of it, or a little something different out of it. And I think that that's one of the coolest things about poetry. So Reese, thank you so much. And with that, enjoy the show. I'm here with my guest, Gina Marselle. Gina is not only a poet, but a high school teacher, a mother, wife, and photographer. You can find her work in many places, including the Alibi, the Rag, Adobe Walls, among a bunch of other places. She's author of the book of poetry called A Fire of Prayer, a collection of poetry and photography, the photography also being hers, and her photography can be found also in a bunch of places, including that book, as well as in Katrina Guarascio's September, or Katrina Crespin, for those who have heard her earlier episode. And Gina, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And as with everybody, I'll start with a poem or two of yours to kind of get people to know Gina a little better.
Okay. I'm going to start with something brand new.
Awesome.
It was recently published in Home Whisperers, the zine.
Nice.
And I really love this opportunity because the young woman who put this together recently had an art show. She's a painter. And she was asking for submissions, and I sent her one, and I thought it was kind of funny because it's Shaylin Jordan, and she was a former student of mine.
Oh, no kidding.
I also had her sister. She was my student when she was 14, and now she's done with college, and she's moved to Washington with her partner and is starting some new adventures, and I love following and keeping up with her artwork, and she's amazing. And so when she was looking for submissions to go along with her abstract art, I sent her something. And it was funny because I always graded her, and this one time she graded me. But I was really happy she accepted my work. This is called I'll Always Remember. I'll always remember the sound of galloping horses, thundering the ground whenever a storm brewed, indigo skies turning black, winds rolling the chickens, sirens sounding a warning, a tornado sighting, cool air swelling over warm air like a tango cradling love. My childhood home surrounded by acres of alfalfa and apple trees, a whisper of a town 50 miles southwest of Chicago, sheltered from most everything but an occasional tempest. When we'd hide in our basement until the echoing sirens quieted, secretly wondering if this was the one that would terrorize tranquility, in a wrath only God could muster, tearing down barns, throwing homes, taking our horses to another land, like Dorothy and Toto in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Like a dream. Black skies cleared, a vibrant yellow sun stretching through a ruptured cloud, chickens calming and pecking the dirt, horses neighing and throwing their heads, rearing in excitement and wonder. Thank you.
Excellent. Awesome. So I actually wanted to get a little story out of the way, and we can talk a little bit about it. We started to chat about it off record. That how we met was back in December, I think, of maybe even before December. Was it November?
I think it was in the end of October.
End of October. And it was this kind of 10 poet bonanza thing at Bookworks that had 10 poets that were with Swimming with Elephants publications. And I actually hadn't even started this podcast yet and was looking. I think I had posted it once on Facebook that I was thinking about starting it, and Katrina saw it and she's like, oh, you should come to this reading. So I went to the reading and it kind of exploded from there. But I want to say that you were actually the very first person that I asked and the very first person who said yes. And I don't know if you recall how that all went down, but the part that I remember the most was that when I asked you and I had your book, you literally grabbed me by the arm and dragged me over to Katrina. I said, Katrina, this guy, he wants to interview me for his show. And it just made me so happy to have somebody just be that excited to have some guy who, one, you didn't know, and two, didn't really have a show yet, to be that excited. So, one, thank you. And two, thank you.
Well, that's even more flabbergasting than just, I didn't know that story, obviously. I do remember telling Kat, I'm like, Kat, I have a fan. And she's like, I think you have more than one fan. And that stems from my own insecurity as a poet, because I wrote my first poem when I was 17, and my mom helped me title it. It's called Silent Flight. And if you were to talk to my mom, she'd be like, Gina has a published poem, and it's in the Library of Congress somewhere as this published poem. And she's always been very proud of that. And it stemmed from my English class where we had to write a sonnet. And, you know, when I was 17, I was like, I didn't really know poetry at that time. I remember reading Thomas Harding, this poem called Ah, Are You Digging on My Grave? And this poem was about this person in the grave being, oh, it's my lover here trying to talk to me, or it's my mom, or it's my dad. It's somebody who appreciates and misses me on the other side. And at the end, it's like, no, mistress, it's just me, your dog. I'm digging my bone and I'm trying to get it. And, you know, so I just remember that. But through the study of that course with that teacher, Miss Wilson, I'll never forget her, she's like, you need to write a sonnet. And I also had to memorize a Shakespearean monologue. Wow. And that was the first time anybody ever really made me work in school in my whole entire, high school career. And I wrote this poem, and it's really cheesy. It's about this dove or an angel flying through the air like a dove, looking at all the trash that is happening on Earth, and we're destroying Earth, and she was like, who's going to come and save this earth? And hence called Silent Flight, because it was an angel. And I just, since then, would write poetry here and there, but never really thought of it seriously. And in 2008, I kind of got involved with the poetry scene here in Albuquerque because I was a teacher with middle school kids who needed an outlet. And I met some people who were in, Sal Tripedi in particular, who was into slam poetry and teaching it to students and getting them involved. And I started meeting the poets like crazy, and they were just, I was in theater all through high school and early parts of college, and I thought those were an interesting group of people. But poets, there's nothing on poets. I mean, they're so unique. And I was like, I found my people. And they were wonderful, and their energy was high level, and the honest and I can't think of that word, but you can cut that out, right?
Oh, of course.
Oh my gosh, it totally. Granted, I need to tell everybody I stayed up late because I had been planning my daughter's graduation party for like the last month, and so I'm a little bit brain dead.
That's all right. I typically come up with the wrong words and just total brain fart, and then I'm just like, I'm just going to explain the word that I mean because...
Well, I already said it because I was like honest. They're honest people, and they have a lot of, they have a lot of will, and they want to change something, and they want to, the poets that I know anyways, they want to make their life better, the people around them, their life better, and I just fell in love with them. And I had a little known art of photography. And that's how I kind of got involved with the poetry scene here, is I offered to photograph. So from 2008 to 2010, I photographed almost every event the slam poets were involved with. I did lots of headshots and beautiful scenes of poets performing. And my unique twist was I'm a film photographer, so all of my stuff was film. So per roll, I had 24 shots.
Oh, wow.
And so I had to make each shot count because it's expensive to print up. And I'm not a digital photographer even to this day. You would not even think I was a photographer. But you look at my film photography and it's decent. But anyways, from there I got involved with the poetry scene, and I slowly came out of my shell and started writing more and sharing more. And so not only was I Gina the photographer, but here I was Gina the poet. And the reason I was so excited for Kat to know that I had a fan is because I always thought of myself as a photographer and not as a poet. So I would start out all of my open mics or my shows with, I'm not really a poet. And Kat in the background would roll her eyes and she'd be like, now Gina. And so I finally feel confident enough to say in my bio, photographer, poet, together. And so again, anyways, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's really cool that, this may be the last interview for the summer just because now I'm on a slam team. That's taking up pretty much my whole summer. So I thought it was really cool that not only were you the first person to say yes, but you're also, it sounds like it might be the last one for the season. So it's really cool to kind of bookend it, at least in my life, not on the podcast itself, but in the podcast in the broader range, that I bookended it with starting with having you be the first person to say yes to being the actual last person on the season to actually come on. So that's cool.
Well, I thought you were like an old pro or something. You did this all the time. And so.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
What a humbling story. So thank you.
Of course. And that's kind of cool because I think I mentioned to you off air that I did listen to one interview you did a few years ago. And you actually said that day was the first day that you felt like a poet. I think I really am trying to find the phrase that you used, because I thought that was awesome. But yeah, today I am a poet. And so I thought that was really cool, that because I kind of go through that same deal of, I had written poetry, and I had started with performance poetry just because it seems more like that's the kind of poetry I understood, because I don't understand like Plath or a lot of the other poets that are traditional poets that everybody likes, and like sonnets and the what is it, the up and down sound. See, I can't think of words either.
The stressing and unstressing.
Yeah,
iambic pentameter.
There you go. I can't hear it. Like I literally, like if somebody's doing it, after a while I'm like, I bet you this is iambic pentameter. But if I'm trying to write it, and that's one of those poetry forms that I've struggled and I've wanted to learn, but I can't hear it. I can't hear that cadence because I grew up in New England, and then I have a linguist for a wife. So she beat the New England accent out of me, and then I ended up with this Western accent, and now I'm in the Southwest, so now I'm picking up that accent. So I don't even know which accent I have. So, but yeah, I don't even know where I was going with that. But it's cool to hear from somebody else that kind of movement from, no, I'm not a poet, but here I am going to read poetry, to, dang it, I'm a poet.
Right.
So I'm curious, it sounds like a lot of what got your start deeper into the poetry scene was your students. So I'm wondering how they react to poetry, if you kind of guide them, at least initially, with the performance side, or basically how that all plays out.
Yeah, so before, like I said, Sal Trapedi had, for a couple of years in 2008, did the slam poetry thing with students, and he kind of put it all together, and I went with it. But then he stopped doing that because he moved on to other adventures and teaching high school. And I didn't really have the slam poets, entourage that he had, where he could get people in. And some of the poets started getting a little bit more well-known, and, they would want a payment for their art, and that's totally understandable. And I'm like, well, how can I pay them?
Right.
So I wrote some grants, and I got some grants, and I got some poets to come in, and one was Jessica Helen Lopez.
That's awesome.
And, we just wrote. It didn't matter if it was slam or traditional. There was no, whatever the kid wrote. And so I've taught it with middle school students. I've taught it with high school students. Every student who's ever known me has had a poetry unit. And I've taught probably 1,500 students. I've been a teacher for 16 years. I'm going on my 16th year. And I just did a poetry unit. I'm back to middle school. I teach gifted and talented students at Van Buren Middle School.
Awesome.
And so, when I say poetry, they're all, most of them, not all. I have one little poet in my class who's like, yes! And everybody else was like, poetry, smortry, I don't know, poetry. But by the end, everybody was so proud of their poetry book. Everybody had to write a sonnet. Everybody had to write a haiku. Everybody had to write an I am poem, because that's what new poets do. They write an I am poem.
Mm-hmm. Like I am?
I am from somewhere. I am,
okay.
Sweet and calm. I am, from tortillas. I am buttermilk, like whatever. I see, the secrets in the stars. It's usually, something like that. And they follow a formula. And everybody had to write a personification poem. And then they could write a free verse. And I taught them a few other poems, like looking at a piece of art and creating poetry from that. And at the end, we selected 5 for our little book, for their little book that they created for themselves. And the students were so proud of it.
That's awesome.
And they had to write a reflection, and almost every single reflection is, I don't really like poetry because I didn't understand it. But, I make them TP cast, which is a technique to analyze poetry. And I ask them to analyze a song. So they might find a rap song or some other lyric that they love. And, I introduced my poetry unit with Tupac and
Nice.
Emily Dickinson.
Nice. So the Tupac, would it happen to be the flower in the
Yeah,
concrete?
the rose that grew from concrete.
Yes.
And so I have this weird philosophy that somehow Tupac studied Emily Dickinson.
Nice. It would not surprise me.
And so I love Emily Dickinson, and her verse is very short and to the point and short-lined, and it's not totally fancy language, and neither was Tupac. They both had tragic endings in their life. But when I read The Rose That Grew from Concrete and Hope is a Thing of Feathers by Emily Dickinson, both of them are like coming from some sort of horridness and making something better. And it's really fascinating. It grabs the kids' attention. I read them really wonderful poems. Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, because the kids that I work with right now at Van Buren have tough upbringings. And we do a Maya Angelou unit, and I show them her reading her poem, Still I Rise, and it's just amazing. I'm getting chills just thinking about her reading her poem.
Yeah.
And, so I read all these wonderful poems to them across cultures, in English, in Spanish. I have one student from Korea, so we, got some Korean poems, awesome. Native American. And so it's not just me with my loves. I'm having the kids find poems for them, and we share poems almost every day. What poem did you find last night? Or song lyric, because some of them didn't want to read poems at all. Mm-hmm. So we looked at the song lyric and the poetry within song lyrics.
That's awesome, because, I have that same problem of not enjoying poetry because I didn't understand it. And that's kind of, like I said, I got my start in performance poetry, because even if you're not understanding the story itself, most performance poets are so emotive that you're still getting the emotion out of it, and so you can kind of pull from that and be like, oh, that's what they meant, because they're crying and emotional, and you're like, oh, that's what I was supposed to pull from that. So that's really cool. And going with the whole forgetting words, I misspoke. It wasn't Sylvia Plath that I didn't understand. It was Emily Dickinson. A lot of her stuff, even though it's super short, and I've watched entire YouTube videos that are like a half hour long explaining single poems of hers, most of her poems I just can't grasp. And so it's cool. I never had a teacher that would actually kind of break poems apart. They just said, poetry is awesome and you should like it. So that's kind of why I started the podcast, is so that I could have folks on that could either be of performance or traditional, but also kind of bridging that gap, and then bridging the gap between people who may not understand or like poetry because they don't understand it.
Right.
And just kind of giving them an outlet for maybe I want to try poetry, or maybe I want to like poetry, but thought it was too over my head. So it's really cool that you're a teacher that would actually kind of drive that love and expression. So that's the kids are I taught AP Lit and Comp a couple of years ago, and that was like my favorite class to teach, because those kids wanted to study literature, and they volunteered, because you don't have to take AP Lit and Comp. And we studied some of the most complex poems, and I broke it down the same way as I teach it with my 8th graders. We start with, what do you think this poem is about? And we look at it in every angle. We tear the poem apart, and then we put it back together. And sometimes we put it back together in our own way, not even the way the poet put it together. Now, is that the
TP Cass?
Can you kind of?
Yeah, sure. I always love to give lessons to folks. This is like been around for many, many, many years. But basically, you look at the title of a poem. So that's the T. P is paraphrase. You paraphrase the poem and put it in your own words. And we like to have the students do it line by line. Some like to do it paragraph or stanza by stanza, but I like to do line by line. And then we look at attitude. We look at any shifts. We look at tone again, or title or theme, depending on what level you're working with your students. And it's just a nice, easy way for kids to break down a poem. And I tell my young students, you can use this all through high school. It'll help you analyze a poem. They really like to talk about the poet's attitude, the speaker's attitude, versus their mood as they're reading it. So I try to talk about that so they don't mix up tone with mood. And then theme, because theme can be, we have a broad subject, of love, but what are they really saying about love? How narrow can we get that love? A love for caterpillars. We have to break it down and, this poem's really about change. It's not just about a caterpillar or loving them. It's about change and metamorphosis into something more. And then death, the circle of life. Because obviously the butterfly dies after 2 weeks. He doesn't get a very long chance to express itself. But the students, I don't know, they didn't hate it as much. That's what all of my reflections said. Even my most hardcore student, I don't like poetry, and why are you making me do this? I have better things to do. and that little kid, he first started writing a sonnet about Ninja Turtles, but then, because he's like, I got nothing. And then he surprised me. He tore up his paper one day, and I'm like, what? Why are you doing that? He's like, And he turned something in, and it was a love poem. Wow. It was this beautiful, beautiful love poem. And not one poem was plagiarized because I threatened them with zeros. And I look up lines, and I'm like, and his was like, wow, this is too good. Where did he get this poem? And he had it in his journal. I went back to his composition book, and he had his edits in there. And I was like, wow, I can't believe he followed all of my suggestions in writing poetry. And another little kid wrote about gaming. And, he's like, I really liked my sonnet. It was about playing a video game and his love for that. And, he's a straight A student, so not a lot of people know that he plays games. He's like, I was able to express myself. And, teaching any kid, but in particular gifted and talented, that creativity aspect is so very important.
That's awesome. Since we're talking about your students, you mentioned off air, at least, that one of your more recent publications, I think, involved one of your former students. So I wanted you to chat about that and then maybe read that poem.
Oh, I did that. This was my intro poem, Home Whispers.
Oh, it was from that.
Yeah.
All right.
And so I do have another publication that we talked about off air, and that's that Poet's Picnic.
Yeah. Let's
and
hit that.
I could talk about that.
Yeah.
So I haven't submitted anything in like a really long time. I think it's going on 2.5 years.
Oh, goodness.
So the first time being published was in April. So I sent 3 things out. 1 thing was rejected and 2 things were accepted. So I was like, okay, at least 2. I mean, if all 3 were rejected, I would be more like Emily Dickinson and shove all of my things in closets and drawers, and somebody would discover it well after I had passed and be like, hey, she wrote poetry. So of course I whined and sniffled about the non-acceptance, but people are like, don't worry about it. There'll be a right place for that piece. Just send it off again. But I haven't sent it off. So this Poets Picnic will be at the Open Space Center on May 26th, and I'm super, super excited. It was an open call for poems, for haiku, and they're changing them into weathergrams. So they're writing these beautiful poems, haiku, with calligraphy on a piece of art paper and then hanging it outside for display. And I sent out 10 because that's what we were allowed to, and they accepted 2. And I was just tickled pink. The first one, I hate prickly pears with a passion. And whenever I sweep out to tidy up my porch, I always like stab myself with one, and then it's almost an immediate infection. It's like I'm kind of allergic to them, and it itches, and it's horrible, and I just think these things are horrifying. However, I notice when they first bloom and flower that bumblebees are obsessed with them and love them.
Really?
And I'm like, oh, I can't cut this down because someone else in nature needs it and loves it. So I wrote this poem. Prickly pears, comfort, stab, wound, safe haven for bumblebees.
Nice.
And another one that I wrote, that was the one of them that was accepted. I grew up with horses, and so a lot of my poems will have information about horses, just because I was around horses from the time I was 2 months on a regular basis, from the time I was about 2 months old until I was 26, maybe 24, somewhere around there. And I grew up literally on a horse farm from the time I was 10 until I moved out when I was 20. So horses was my life. I, helped with feeding and watering and cleaning out stalls. My mom was a horse trainer, like a horse whisperer. She's amazing with horses.
Nice.
And she got me a horse when I was 10, she was my soulmate. So anyways, this little haiku is just to honor horses, which are my favorite animals. West Mesa thunderclouds rumble through a gray sky like wild horses.
Awesome.
And then this last little haiku I'll share was the second poem that was accepted. And I moved out here from the Midwest. So a lot of my poetry, as you noticed in my book when you went through it, I talk about the Midwest a lot, and I talk about New Mexico because those are like my two homes. And when I first came to New Mexico, I was fascinated by the sky. Because up by Chicago, there's skyscrapers and trees and cornfields and whatnot, but everything seems to cloud the sky. But when I was driving out here and on I-25, when you get past Durango and you start getting into northern New Mexico and then get towards central, you're like, oh my God, look at this sky. I remember like looking, when I first came out here driving by myself, I had all my windows turned. I didn't even look at the road. I was just like looking out the sky like a happy dog. I'm like, oh my gosh, look at the sky. And so this poem kind of honors that. This New Mexico sky, an ocean of dreams, blessing spirits.
Awesome. Yeah, I have to say that I kind of had the same reaction because I grew up in New England, and it took moving to Colorado first, back in like 2000, for me to realize that sunsets were a thing.
Oh.
Because, yeah, even in New England, the sun sets over the trees or the house across the street. And the sky will turn pink occasionally, but
Right.
Yeah, out here, my better half even says, don't the clouds look closer? Like, it's just, that expanse is just, yeah, there are many times where I'll just stare at the sky for no reason at all.
My daughter, her like little secret hobby, I would say, is photographing the sky. Like sometimes we're driving and I have to stop the car so she can get out and take a picture. And, we all admire it. I have a 5-year-old son, and we're all like, what did you get? What did I see? And we sit and stare at it, at the phone picture, because the sky, what we notice is she'll take the picture and then it's gone. The sun sunk, a second deeper into the horizon, and that beautiful coloring that you see is gone. So, that purple, that deep, deep purple, when it looks like it's hitting the land, and the volcanic eruption of that purple is amazing.
It is. I've struggled really hard because I know a lot of folks who used to move out to this end of the country would write poetry or stories about the West and the Southwest, and then people would just move here. So I didn't want to be that guy who came to this end of the country and just wrote about New Mexico and canyons and all the beauty, but it's really hard not to, because and everybody's like, oh, you should come back to New England. I'm like, yeah, but it's so much prettier out here. And then they just say, no, it's all brown and dirt. I'm like, yeah,
they've never seen the sunset.
Exactly. The first time I actually saw a sunset, I was in Colorado, and it was at Loveland Lake, or Lake Loveland, however you say it. And everybody said, oh, if you want to see a sunset, you got to go here. And yeah, the whole sky turned that deep, deep purple. The sun fell behind the Rocky Mountains, and it just lit up the lake, and I just burst into tears. It was the first time I had ever seen a real, actual sunset that wasn't either in a photograph or, just over the trees.
Right.
So it's moving to actually witness that on an almost daily basis.
No, I write about it a lot.
I do too. I'm one of those now. So yeah, why don't we chat about your book a little bit? And I wanted to say kind of right off the bat that A Fire of Prayer is probably one of the more positive collections of poems I've read, which is really cool. Not just because, hey, it's positive, but that, I don't know, like it didn't feel fake, which is usually what I think of when I'm like, oh, positive poetry, or not dark poetry. At least in my mind, I'm like, oh, well, that must be just fake. But I didn't feel, it wasn't until I finished it and sat down and put it down and just started thinking about it for a while. I was like, wow, most of these, are about your children or your trips out to the Midwest, and some about love. There's even one in here that I was going to ask you to read if you were okay with it, but I don't write like Neruda.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to say or ask kind of what brought this collection into fruition, especially since, at least for a while, you didn't consider yourself a poet. So what kind of brought this about?
Well, it's back to Magic Cat.
Everything goes back to Katrina.
Cat knows I love her to pieces, and, I admire her all the time. But she came to me one day, and I knew she had started SWEP, Swimming with Elephant Publications, and we're going on our 5th year this coming November. So we probably did meet in November, because she usually has an anniversary show in
probably. November.
And she's like, I want to put a book together for you. And I'm like, for me? She's like, yeah, poetry. And I'm like, poetry and photography. And I'm like, oh, and photography, of course. And, so I was like, I'm like, how about just, and she's like, you're not just a poet. You're a poet and a photographer. And I like to put that together. And I was like, all right, I think I can do this. And so I started out on this 1.5-year journey. 5 edits later, poor Cat. But she knows I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I'm an avid book reader my whole entire life. I probably should have been a literature teacher at the college level, but never thought I was capable of doing something like that. And of course, when I was younger, I loved photography and theater, and didn't know how much I loved literature, because it was just part of my life. That's why I brought like 10 books with me today.
She did. They're all over the table.
Because I'm like, I don't know where this is going, and I have to be prepared in case something comes up. And I didn't want to mess up a word, and mess up words anyways. Integrity, that's what I wanted to say earlier. That would not come out of my mouth to save my life.
I'm keeping it in now, because now it's just going to wrap around.
So when somebody who is listening to this are like, oh, English teachers do make mistakes.
We're all human.
And you're right. My poetry book is incredibly honest. Practice what you preach. I appreciate honesty and integrity to the core. And also, I don't have anything to give my children. I don't have heirlooms. And so this book, one of the reasons I worked so hard on it, it was for them. So I can give one to my daughter and to my son. That's why there's so many poems at the end about, motherhood and my daughter and my son and my husband. The beginning part, the poetry book is in two parts. Finding Breath and Solace. And so Finding Breath, there's a poem in there about suicide, actually, because my uncle committed suicide and a cousin committed suicide and friends have committed suicide. And, but I put it in there because, as you said, it's mostly positive, is I wanted to show people that the first part of my poem is a little bit of struggle in life. And how do we get over that? How do we make things better? My daughter, I mention her a lot because it was just she and I for the first 12 years of her life. I was a single mom and struggled big time. And I had help from my family, but I was there for all the fallings and all the teacher conferences and all of this and that. Ballet. She's a ballerina. And so many dance recitals and dance every single night, sometimes 6 nights a week, driving to and fro. And I wanted to showcase how much I love and appreciate them and how much they have admired. I admire them and that they're my muse a lot of the times. And so one of the things I tell my students and I tell anybody is write what you know. It'll be a better poem. Sometimes it takes me a really long time to get there, and that's why there's so many edits, because I'll write a 75-line poem, but really only 5 lines work, because they're like, this is what you're trying to say, it's right. Like I said something to Kat recently, and she's like, those last 4 paragraphs are really awesome. Like, the 12 before that, not so. It's like I was trying to get up courage to say what I really needed to say. And I do have a lot of anxiety, and it's taken me a long time to talk through my anxiety. And, before I came to this interview, I was like, okay, I have to do what I teach everybody, and I have to do my breathing exercises, and I am calm. I am a poet. I am ready to do this. And that's what I kind of hope my poetry book, A Fire of Prayer, came from a title of opposites, because you don't really think of prayer as being a fire. And I was doing this writing exercise with some of the poets in town at a writing workshop, and they're like, put opposites, something you would think of as positive here and something negative here. And I was like, this was before I was even asked to write a book. I'm like, fire prayer, that's really cool. Because I love prayer and meditation. And when Kat asked me to do my book, I'm like, well, I already have a title. It's going to be called A Fire of Prayer. And she's like, all right, awesome. And I'm really proud of it. It turned out, it's maybe sold 1 or 2. I give a lot away. Kat gave me 180 copies.
Oh my gosh.
And I only have 10 left. And I don't remember if people bought those. I gave them, I traded them. But we've sold them at the Bookworks. And it's old now. It's going on 3 years. And so
yes, it's ancient history now.
I'm working on a new manuscript for the last 2.5 years. I really started it last summer because I went to New York City with my daughter, because my daughter is a ballerina, like I said, and she got this amazing opportunity to go to American Ballet Theater in New York City for a summer collegiate program. We fundraised like crazy for it. But I wasn't going to send a 17-year-old to New York City by herself, so I had to take up all of my courage in the whole entire world. And we took a train 45 hours to get to New York City. And one of my former students who works and lives in New York City, we stayed with her in Brooklyn. Well, actually, two former students. One I had kept touch with, and one was happened to be her roommate from middle school. Yeah.
Wow.
They're amazing. And my students that I have now, because, you know, they're 8th graders, like, your students like you? They keep in touch with you? And I'm like, yeah, only you guys don't really like me. But in 2 years, you'll send me a letter like, thanks for teaching me how to write poetry and write essays. I really appreciate it. I care too much for these kids sometimes. I follow them to lunch, and I'm like, let's go work on your essay. That's due in, you know, an hour in my class. But I started working on my manuscript in New York City because I had this whole month where I had no husband and no son. And I had all this free time because my daughter was in ballet class for 8 hours each day. And we would take the train in, and then I'd walk up to the library or to a favorite coffee shop that I found, and I would write. And I have, I don't know, probably 100 poems that I need to organize and go through, and I just haven't. And I feel sometimes overwhelmed, like, how do writers and poets publish books? How do they organize them? How do they put it together? How do you find an editor? And how do you have the bravery to share this poem with someone? Because it means something to you, because I wrote it. Mm-hmm. It means something to me, but maybe it doesn't mean anything to the person who's reading it, and they won't get it, and then it'll be rejected.
Okay, now I have to stop you and tell you a story. The very first poem I ever had accepted into a actual poetry book was a haiku, and I didn't even remember which one it was. I just got an acceptance letter. I'm like, yay, it's going to be in print, and I'm excited. And I got it in the mail because, you know, you have to buy it. And I opened it, and I was like, I don't even understand what I was trying to say. It was just one of those haiku it was a throwaway haiku, and I just sent it, and it was published, and I'm like, ooh, I know, this is a really bad one. And Melanie was like, you should read it to me. I said, I am not reading this out loud. So I handed her the book, and she read it, and she's like, I don't get it. But that's the problem. I don't either. And that's actually one of the things that I fear when I have folks on, when we start talking about their book, that I've shied away from asking specifics about poems in here. I may ask, you know, talk about this one. It sounds like it's this topic. But I'm always worried, like, I have bunches of underlines and comments, and I'm worried that if I talk about that phrase, they'll be like, that is not, like, I don't even know how you got McDonald's out of this. But so yeah, I've always feared. I don't even know where we started, but
well, you know, the thing I tell my students is, you know, each poem is going to mean something different to each reader, because we bring different stories and life experiences to that poem when we read it. So I love reading Mary Oliver with my students. She has this poem about the sun in particular, and I don't recall the title, but I love reading it with my students. I haven't done it in a couple of years because I used to read it with my freshman students. And really the poem wasn't just about the sun. It was about money and finances and having things we don't necessarily need, when really the sun over here is all you really need. You know, like, you know, it's so beautiful, and why do you need this expensive car or art piece or whatever? And, you know, each student, when we discussed it and talked about, oh yeah, I didn't think about that, or oh yeah, I didn't think about that, or even me, who's taught this poem for 6 years to freshmen. At the time I had been teaching freshmen in high school for 6 years. Each time I read it, I got a different idea, a different thought, a different journey with them. And that's the beauty of poetry. And I think that's why it's lasts. Like Shakespeare, you know, who cares who actually wrote it if Hamlet really wrote it? Mm-hmm. I mean, if Shakespeare really wrote Hamlet, the soliloquies and monologues in Hamlet are classic. Yeah. They're here through time, and the universal themes are there through time, and we get it. We get like that one poem I told you about in my book about suicide and Hamlet's to be or not to be, to contemplate that so many people have. And that's a universal theme. You know, Hamlet lost his dad. That's a universal theme. Maybe you didn't get to say what you wanted to say to your dad, or your parent or a loved one. And, you know, a lot of times when we read poetry in class, some of my students will start to cry. And other kids will be like, why are they crying? And, you know, I'm like, well, something hit a core. Something in that poem meant something to that kid. And, you know, let them cry. Ask them if they're okay, but you got to get it out. And literature can be really magical and a lifesaver. And I think that's another reason why I'm apprehensive about my writing, is because I read great literature all the time, you know. And when I read it, I'm like, oh, I'm not that good. But I try to write like some people to learn their craft. And Hope is a Thing with Feathers is a poem that I mimic. I had my daughter mimic it, and she had to, in her AP Lit class, she had to write a poem mimicking. She did a whole thing on Emily Dickinson. She's like, Mom, I need a poet. And I'm like, well, I got a poet for you. So her AP Lit and Comp, she doesn't know I'm going to share this, for her English language arts class, and it's like 40 pages long. She did an awesome job. Wow. And she had to analyze a bunch of poems by Emily Dickinson. And at first she came to me crying. I don't get it. Why do you read this stuff? You know, what is she talking about? What is this liquor that she never brewed? What kind of liquor don't you brew? You know, and you know, so I said, you know, let's start with Hope is a Thing with Feathers. And so she had to write a poem like Emily Dickinson. And she wrote this poem, and it's beautiful. And she got a 50 out of 50, so her teacher also thought it was beautiful. So Dance is a Thing with Life. So Hope is a Thing with Feathers is Emily Dickinson's poem. Dance is a thing with life. It moves your body and sings to your soul, and is more than just a hobby, and breathes in, out. And only Copeland completes lines, develop to the stars. Your form must align. I've heard it means to unite, in such intricate movement, but is internally beautiful. There's always room for improvement.
Nice, that's awesome.
And I also told my daughter, write what you know, and so that's why she wrote about dance. And here's the poem. I think it might be my favorite poem in the whole world. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
Wow. That's awesome.
You know, and here we are, we're all this little bird being abashed from the storm. You're just throwing that little bird against the window, and that little bird is going to die. But he doesn't. He comes up like hope, and he survives. And whenever I feel kind of down or hopeless, I think of this poem, almost like a prayer or a meditation, and I'm like, not yet. I'm not ready to be broken.
That is great.
And so I come back up because I still have hope.
What was the name of that one again? I may end up using that as my little...
It's called Hope is a Thing with Feathers. And I think it might be poem 314 because Emily Dickinson didn't title her poems.
Yeah.
And so her poems are numbered, 314. I believe it was her cousin or her sister-in-law or somebody discovered all these poems that she wrote after her death. And, she never married. Emily Dickinson never married. She was fond of a teacher of hers, but never married. And kind of was a depressed person, sad, but wrote all the time, and kept everything a secret. And they just discovered it. And she didn't have any titles, so somebody just started numbering them, 1 through, I think, 1,500. Oh, I might be incorrect. Don't quote me on that, but...
I'm quoting you on it anyway. No. Let's see. Were there other poems that you wanted to make sure folks heard before we...
if there's a poem you would like, you mentioned something about I Don't Write Like Neruda.
Yeah. I think that gets to some of the topics we had already kind of chatted about.
So I mentioned to you I want to write like these great writers, and I'm not able to yet, nor will I be able to. Did I not bring my own book?
Did you want my copy?
I thought I had it in my collection of books, but I don't. Okay, so my husband and I wanted to write a love poem to him, but I don't write like Neruda. So our wedding vows included a Neruda poem.
Oh, wow.
As part of our ceremony, because my husband's from Santiago, Chile, and he's been to Neruda's house.
What?
Yeah, it's like a museum. And so I wanted to honor that, and I have the poem. It was part of our vows, and I loved it. So I wrote this to my husband. It's called "But I Don't Write Like Neruda." When I sit on opposite ends of the couch from my husband watching reruns of The King of Queens, I think about love poems I could write, but don't. We wrap ourselves under a blanket so that the winter chill sits outside our snug warmth, jealous. I'm content with the laugh track timed to the wisecracks of Doug and Carrie. We lay cold toes on each other's lap, quietly massaging aches. Our feet pulse against the pressure of his kneading. We fit nicely together. Marriage fills emptiness with belonging, any kind of belonging, even our breath belonging, inhaling and exhaling as one, with each beat lungful and melody, surviving in this world in slim tails and lights and shadows, mirrors faced each day, never forgetting any history of self, finding similarities between ourselves and the reruns we watch. Sometimes we have to blanket imperfections inside the comfort of breath, inside a Neruda-like love poem. But I don't write like Neruda. So my love poems come from the inhales and exhales of marriage in quiet moments like this.
That's one of my favorites from there. And I initially was going to ask you why you didn't think you wrote like Neruda, but I am basically going to not, because we kind of chatted about the anxiety, and I kind of go through that too with my own stuff. But I thought that poem kind of spoke both to your own insecurities, but also to the fact that this reads very much like a Neruda poem, where it talks about love in its truest sense and doesn't really... It paints a picture that isn't what most people think of when they think of love. Just cold feet together, right, and, watching reruns.
Well, it's very common and ordinary. And there's extraordinary moments in marriage, in all marriages. But, my daughter and I, she's getting ready to go to college, so that's why she's in my mind and in this interview a lot, because it's just been daughter. And son is graduating from preschool on this coming Friday, so he's going to be in a green cap and gown, and my daughter is at Albuquerque High School, which is green. So I'm cheesy mom, so I'm going to make them stand together so I can photograph them in their two little, matching graduation. But there's milestones, and I've been thinking about that a lot. what's the next milestone? Because when your child graduates from high school, you look back. And, I dug out her kindergarten scrapbooks and her kindergarten, work that I had saved. And she's got this, diploma in her hand in her kindergarten outfit, graduating outfit. And then I have her senior picture, and the graduation party. I had all these little kid pictures of her growing up. And here she is. And then I think back to when I graduated. And, I've been thinking about, because we always tell our graduating students, you want to live a life you don't regret, and on my way coming to this interview, I'm like, what if he asked, do you have any regrets, and I do. I wish I would have written more. I wish I would have published more. I wish I wouldn't have had a fear, sometimes people are like, oh, I have a gig, or I have this, or I have that. And I have a little bit of jealousy. I'm like, I want that. I want to have a gig. I want to travel to so-and-so place. I want to be cool and like that, But I have all these little extraordinary things of a marriage and children and a teacher. And even though it's very common and ordinary, it's sort of like the New Mexico sunset. It's extraordinary to my life. Yeah. And sometimes, that's more important than the self-centeredness of, I must write, I must publish this poem, I must do this, I have to take this photograph. And there's not enough of me to do all of that. So I have to do a little bit at a time, hence the 2.5 year, hiatus. And the only thing I've been going to is writing workshops that Jessica Helen Lopez holds, or Kat Crespin holds with SWEP. And I love those because I know I'll get writing done and I'll get something that's worthy.
That's awesome. That's beautiful. And that's cool that you can kind of both recognize. And I don't think being a teacher or a mom is little.
Thanks.
That's not something to belittle by any stretch of the imagination. Although I do go through that too, where, I didn't even I hadn't even read poetry until 2.5 years ago. It was a thing I just gave up caring about. So now when everybody's like, oh, you're a poet and you write lots of poetry and you know lots of poets. Oh, have you read this? I'm like, no, I don't even know that name. So there's lots that I don't know. And yeah, it's because, well, you pick and choose what is important to you at the moment. And I actually get in trouble a lot from my better half because I'll go on camping retreats by myself just to kind of refocus life, and I never take pictures because I'm so in the moment that I just am just there. And she's like, oh, well, let's see pictures. I'm like, oh, I forgot. So yeah, there's nothing little about life.
Sometimes I take too many photos. Like my son, who's 5, right? He already has his model pose put together because then he can have more opportunity to play if he just gets the picture out of the way. And I felt bad that I didn't get more pictures last night at my daughter's graduation. I'm like, I'm a terrible mom. I'm like, I didn't get a picture of the graduation cake because we probably had 60 people at this party, and I'm pretty much a recluse, and it's just me and my son. Like because my daughter's always at dance and my husband's always at work, and when I get home from school, it's just my son and I, and we pretty much hide in a cave. And so I was a little overwhelmed with all the folks, and it was a beautiful party, and I loved every moment of it. And I was just complimenting our life because here my daughter's graduating from college, and she's in a 4.06.
Wow.
I didn't even have that good of grades when I was in school, so I'm super proud of her. And I hope I am always telling her it's okay to be a ballerina if that's what you want to be, in life, because people are always like, well, you might want to do something that's going to be, get you money and be able to pay the bills and whatnot. And so she doesn't know if she wants to be a dancer or a medical doctor. But I'm probably the weird mom that's like, you should be a dancer. You should be a ballerina. That is your art to save the world.
That's an awesome mom, though. That's an awesome mom.
And, I do have another poem I wanted to read that I didn't talk about.
Yeah. Why don't
Okay.
you read that. We'll talk about it and we'll wrap things up.
Okay. So I have been working on this poem for a few years.
Wow.
And I think I finally kind of have it at a finished spot. And my whole poetry book is about my life, my personal life, just me and the things that I experienced, or it's about my family or the people around me. And this one is called Josephine Died, Only Remembering Her Name. And it's for my great-grandma Jo, who died from complications of Alzheimer on January 18th, 1999. And she survived 2 husbands and a world war. And this quote is from the Odyssey. One more labor lies in store, boundless, laden with danger great and long, and I must brave it out from start to finish. I need the rowboat of my childhood, a paddle and a lake, need to row untethered until my emotions are exhausted from physical exertion, need the comfort of water when I could row until I could no longer hear the parental warning that going so far out could be fatal. A drifter, always, even now, I write, paint, read, explore the pain of feeling. Is not worth any risk. I am tethered down as far from water as the moon is from sun. I don't find me in this poem or in the watercolor paint splatter. I hurt like you. I want happiness like you. I want love like anyone. Sometimes I think I'm only here visiting while my daughter and son grow to adulthood. Then my travels will begin again. Like Odysseus, I'll travel seeking abyssal adventure. Spread my wings wide. I will stretch my swimming body into dolphin form, metamorphosis. Glide from here to there. You will ask, why are you sitting here alone? And I will answer, I don't know. Some days it's clear. I reach and reach with revolution to change every wrong, to complete every right, to balance my bank account, to wear stilettos until tall. Child, daughter, sister, photographer, teacher, writer, poet, wife, mother, friend, almost motherless, almost orphan. I'm on this lifeboat with a suitcase full of goods, a turkey sandwich, and a bottle of water, almost floating, almost drifting, so far from everyone. I've just enough connection. I can gut a fish with my fillet knife, always kept sharp. I can cut pieces easily out of my heart. If you left today, I'll miss you. Place your memory in my pocket until it falls into nothingness. My great-grandmother Josephine had Alzheimer's. She died only remembering her name. Memories lost, life lost, sadness misplaced. Josephine died only remembering her name. She died only remembering her name. But she gifted me with strength, and I remember more than just her name.
Awesome. Wow. That was powerful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, anything else before we get to the icebreaker poems? Or?
I know. I really, again, appreciate this time, and it's fun to read your poetry and hear yourself read your poetry. And, you know, every once in a while, I'm like, wow, I wrote a nice line there. Or the editor in me is like, you forgot to put a comma there. Or that enjambment is wrong and you should re-edit it.
I don't even know that word.
Oh, that's my favorite tool.
What is it?
Enjambment. So sometimes I'm unsure of what editing mark I should have. So I use enjambment and I break the line where it sounds good. So maybe I wanted some drama, but I don't necessarily need a comma or a dash. I just break the line. And so then I put the rest of that sentence on another line, and that's called enjambment.
Oh.
And for especially my English language learners who don't know where periods or commas go anyway, because they're focusing on reading and writing a new language, I'm like, don't put any punctuation in your poem, and just break your line where it sounds good to you.
That's
and
awesome.
So they love that freedom, and then they don't get stuck with, well, do I end it here? Is that Miss Marselle doesn't like fragments, and she hates commas, splices, and what do I do? I'm like, enjam it.
That's hilarious. The first poem that I wrote, because I have a whiteboard that sits behind me, and it was mostly for my novel writing. But when I started doing performance poetry, which tends to be a lot longer, I started using the board for that.
That's a good idea.
And so I'll write out at least my thoughts or little pieces that I think I like, and then step back and then draw colorful arrows all around. And I had it up there one day, and it was the first one that I left up because I accidentally left it up because I'm also very anxious about other people reading my stuff. So I usually take a picture or write it down on paper and then erase it before Melanie gets home. And I left that one up. And I come home that night, and she had corrected all the grammar.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, what are you doing? She's like, the grammar was all wrong here. I was like, it's a poem, and it's not done yet. What are you doing to me? But yeah.
Well, you can change meaning with a comma or a dash.
Yeah, easily. Yeah, no, I want to thank you too, because like I said, you were the first person that said yes, and you were so excited when you said yes that I came home and I told Melanie, I was like, that whole podcast thing that I was toying with, and she's like, yeah, I told you to do it. I said, yeah, now I think I kind of have to. Now I think I kind of have to. And that was almost 6 months ago now.
Well, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Because it's a really beautiful gift to the poets in our community and whatever, out of the community, because their voice is now immortalized, so we can go back and listen to what other poets have said and shared.
Yeah, I always say that I started the podcast so that I could bring people in and just have people read poetry to me, which was mostly what it was. So, when people read poetry, and you probably noticed, I just sit back and kind of close my eyes and enjoy, which is why I usually never have questions about the poem. But, the other half is just another one of those outlets. And yeah, all this was new to me, so it's been really cool to have a lot of poets kind of be really excited about it too. So yeah. All right, so icebreaker poems this week. I know I've done Senru a lot on the show, but they're short and easy to learn, so I went with Senru again. Basically a haiku, but with no real restrictions outside of the 17 syllables. And since I liked yours better, I'm going to go first, and then we'll end with yours and say adieu. So mine, since we're in Albuquerque and it's actually warm today, wrote about the sun. Sunbeams burn harder against the skin with no one to hold you all day.
Oh.
Yes.
Thank you. So mine has a title because I needed some extra syllables. And it's titled Generational Blessings. And don't count the syllables because I don't know if I got 17.
We're all counting.
Grandpa drove hours, surprised granddaughter at her grad party. Tears of joy.
Awesome. Yay. Excellent. Gina, again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it was better than I had thought because I was nervous, and I even talked to you about messing up a word, so that's gonna be my don't listen to the radio show because I messed up a word, which will make everybody listen to it so that they can hear me mess up a word.
So now I am absolutely leaving it in.
So you have to say interview with Gina. Watch English teacher mess up simple words.
And that is exactly how I will intro it. But thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank my guest Gina Marselle again for coming on the show. It was purely by happenstance that Gina was first to agree to come on the show, and one of what was supposed to be the last episodes for the season. That is no longer going to be the case, though. Apparently, the universe wants me to keep doing this. Gina mentioned a Poets Picnic event coming up on this Saturday, May 26th, at the Open Space Visitor Center out on Coors, if you live here in Albuquerque. I've already had several poets reach out to me and ask if they could be on the show. And so I am not going to back away from those, because some of them are folks that I dearly appreciate. So yeah, this is not going to be the last episode until September. We are just going to barrel right through. I may do the episodes may be a tad more sporadic between now and September, but I'm hoping at least 2 per month still. You can find Gina's book, A Fire of Prayer, on swimmingwithelephants.com or on Amazon. And thank you, everybody. Thanks again for listening, and stay safe.